first of all, people believe that it could be a massive object that's caused the Kuiper Belt cliff, essentially, pushing stuff out of its way as it goes around the thing. And it could be a massive object, but when they say massive, they're talking about an object anywhere from 30 to 70 times the size of Earth. This is a small object, if it is one. Not the size of Jupiter, not anything else. That's not what we're looking at with the Kuiper Belt cliff. So if he thinks it's a brown dwarf star, or his Jupiter-sized object, whatever that would be, certainly not a brown dwarf star, but whatever you would want to say, it's not that. But a bigger problem with that is the internal contradiction there that he has, because I thought this thing was supposed to come from the south. It's going to be on the perpendicular. It's not on the ecliptic. That's how we explain the fact that we can't see it. So you can't have it both ways. Either it's orbiting up and down, or it's causing the Kuiper Belt cliff. You can't have such an obvious internal contradiction there. Now, he, of course, brings us all into biblical prophecy, even though he's, from what I can gather, extremely contemptuous of Christianity and the Bible and everything. But he uses it for his own purposes. And he says some very wrong things. Essentially, his premise is that the writers of various prophecies, of which the Bible being one, he names a number of others, which I may or may not talk about. I'll just say like what he calls the Colburn Bible, which we'll talk about in a minute. He says, they were all essentially trying to tell the world that this cyclical event comes every so often, and we need to be prepared for it. And he says that what is happening, what's described in the book of Revelation, for instance, is the same event that happened with the Noah's flood and with the 10 plagues of Pharaoh in Egypt. He said all three of those things are a result of Nibiru's various passages 3 times. Problems all over the place. Number one is that if the Bible was written for the purpose of, or at least this section of the Bible or whatever was written for the purpose of warning us about the cyclical event that supposedly happens, it really went the wrong way about it. Because what the Bible does is it goes out of its way to say what is happening in the book of Revelation is like no other time that has ever been, no, nor ever shall be. It is distinctly different. Let me give you a few examples. Everything in the sea dies. Everything in not just the salt water, but the fresh water dies. All vegetation is destroyed. Okay? This is like unprecedented, to say the least. I could go on to describe many more cataclysmic, unprecedented events. But in addition to the severity of what's being described in the book of Revelation, and comparing that to, say, the 10 plagues of Egypt, frogs and stuff like that, Egypt would have known a little bit more about this if, like, every piece of vegetation in the world perished and everything in the sea died. They'd be recording that a little bit different than a bunch of frogs showed up and then, the firstborn's sons died and stuff like that. It's just not the same thing. There's just no comparison. He goes through, his book trying to make these comparisons, but it's like completely trying to fit square pegs into round holes. It just doesn't work. In addition to the Bible's consistent reports that the day of the Lord, that is the eschatological judgment, not only is distinct, verses saying this is not going to be like anything else that your fathers have been through. You've got internal contradictions of it saying stuff like about Noah, never again will I judge the world like that. You've got places within the Bible itself that make you know that the day of the Lord is not going to be like any other time. But even more than that, and it's speaking of the day of the Lord and what's happening in the book of Revelation, it goes to some length to say that this is a specified thing that happens to a certain amount of people, to certain people, I should say. That is the wicked. The day of the Lord is just the destruction of the wicked. The day in which they get what they deserve. Okay? The day of the Lord, that's its function. Almost, no matter what people's view on the rapture is or whatever, they essentially agree on this point, that what happens in the day of the Lord, with God's wrath, somehow, some way, it is not for the righteous. And the reason it's not just one verse, God has not appointed us to wrath. It's like every mention of the day of the Lord, this is not going to be for you. Anyway, the reverse of that, the Planet X version, is that this thing undiscriminately comes into our solar system and destroys whoever is not in a bunker or whoever's not in an ark. And, as he calls these arcs, these things where the elites will escape and stuff like that. So, and then his version of how everybody gets enlightened, because the guy's a New Ager, he channels, these beings and stuff, which is finally why I couldn't figure him out for a long time. I was like, is this guy like just a charlatan? Because, he's clearly saying things that are untrue, and I guess I thought he was just trying to make money, but then I realized at some point, listening to a radio interview, and he was talking about how he got all this information from the spirit world, and then it hit me. He's like, oh, this guy just is a complete believer that the entities that he's talking to have his best interest in mind. Even the occultists would laugh at such a notion, that one has such blind devotion to anything that they get told, and not realizing that these things are much smarter than us, have agendas. He would be in a very small group of people that were not wary about that kind of thing, or had no mechanism for testing them, and especially if they lie to him about scientific stuff, which clearly has happened. Nevertheless, that's sort of where he's coming from. Anyway, the idea he says we're going to get enlightened by is by virtue of us getting rid of our paradigm. Okay, ever heard that one before? Once you go through this great cataclysm, you'll realize that Christianity was a bunch of hooey, and you'll become an ancient astronaut theorist. That's what he says in his book, almost verbatim, except he doesn't call it an ancient astronaut theory. So once you become an ancient astronaut theorist and get rid of Christianity, according to him, that's going to cause an evolution. Well, it didn't work for Giorgio Tsoukalos. I don't think it's going to work for other people either, even if Planet X is going on at the same time. And of course, because that doesn't work, he has to do what I call throwing the kitchen sink at it in regard to these people that... I love it when a New Ager tries to tell you why you're going to get evolved, because that's always where the sticky part is. Well, it's going to be because the galactic alignment, which of course happened 3 million years ago and isn't going to happen for another 30 million years, so that's a lie. Demons lied to me on that one, says... well, they wouldn't say it, but David Wilcock, of course, promotes it. And others. So what I'm saying is they never say, or the photon belt or something, which of course is channeled information, which is totally bogus and obviously can't work. You can see my David Icke debunked movie for more on debunking of the photon belt, or you can just Google it. Anyway, so he says, okay, so it's not just that you have to get rid of your Christianity and become an ancient astronaut theorist, and that's how you become evolved, although he says that. He says it's also because you go through this great cataclysm and that changes you. And because the cataclysm is so great, and here is where he brings in Velikovsky and essentially the idea of evolutionary, you become evolved when cataclysms happen. Now, this is kind of comparing apples and oranges, even though it doesn't really sound like it. If you say that cataclysm will turn you into an enlightened being, and as evidence for that, you submit that evolution in the past or whatever was a result of catastrophic events happening and animals adapting to their environment after that. Yeah, those animals probably had to go, this is assuming that worldview or whatever, those animals, let's say a cataclysm happened and the food sources change, so they got to develop new skills or different beaks or whatever to get those food items, since there's a scarcer thing because of the cataclysm. Yeah, that would accelerate adaptation to the environment, but you're still a million miles away from that. Changes them into super beings with cool powers, and now they're much more evolved in their mind, and that's a different thing. Then of course he pulls the old Alice Bailey with the sun rays are going to do it. And that's sort of where he goes mostly, is the sun's going to get real cool and it's going to change us into enlightened beings and stuff like that. So, and again, I'd have to say, if that's happening via Planet X, when is that going to happen again? It's certainly not anytime soon. Certainly not this solar cycle, we'll say. Anyways, so that's Marshall Masters debunked there for you.